Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today on all things contractors related in the US. Delighted to be joined today by Clark and Carla at WTT. We'll just wait a minute or so to let people come in. We're obviously just starting on the hour, so I'm sure there's a few lunch breaks about to kick off. We know that people like to enjoy a sandwich and a coffee while listening to our webinars. If you've not been on a session with us before, then please do say hello. Feel free to jump into chat, introduce yourself, let us know where you are and your interest in today's session. As we go through the topics today, I will be giving plenty of time at the end for Q&A, which is always really interesting. So if you can use the Q&A function on Teams, put your questions in there. Then as we get to the back end of the session, probably leaving a good 10-15 minutes where we can go through some of those questions. So please don't be a stranger, say hello on chat and pop those questions into Q&A as we run through. We've still got a couple of people joining, so I think we're probably good to kick off in 20 seconds or so. Okay, so it looks like the joiner numbers are starting to slow down now, so I think we're in a good position to kick off. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, where we're going to be focusing on the compliance, tax and operational considerations for businesses, well, in particular UK recruitment businesses, when they're needing to understand entering the US market. Obviously, the United States represents a significant growth opportunity for UK recruiters. It's also one of the most complex labour markets globally. You've got rules operating at a federal or state level. How those interact will be really interesting, and I'm sure we're going to get into some of that nuance today. Everything's evolving. Worker misclassification rules continue to get ever more complex state by state. You've got a variety of different insurance requirements as well. So we're going to try and cover some of these topics in a reasonable level of detail over the next sort of 45 minutes. And we'll then look at some of the topics that we really want to specifically explore. So we're going to look at using employer of record and agent of record models and how they might be appropriate for UK recruiters looking to come into the US. We're going to take a little bit of a look at contract structures and enforceability, and it's going to be great to have some insight from Carla in particular on that point. We'll then move on to that hot topic of worker misclassification. It doesn't matter whether you're talking IR35 in the UK, whether you're doing a webinar on Ireland or Germany or any country for that matter. It's always top of the list of people wanting to make sure we don't fall foul of getting the tax wrong and classifying people as self-employed or employed. We'll cover off insurance requirements and what the potential exposure is. And then the last topic will be a little bit of future horizon scanning. If you haven't got enough things to think about currently, then we'll look at what the legislation might move to further down the line and make sure you're not caught unawares there. And as I say, we'll leave 15 minutes at the end for questions. So please do make use of the Q&A function. Pop those questions in as they occur, and we'll make sure we come back round to them at the end. So today's webinar is brought to you by Giant Group and WTT, who are a specialist in consultancy around all things tax and employment law related. Delighted to welcome today Carla Roberts and Clark. Carla is Director of Legal Services at WTT. She's dual qualified UK and US lawyer, so absolutely the right person to have on today's session. She specialises in recruitment, employment and workforce compliance, advising both UK recruitment agencies on the challenges of US expansion, including things like federal and state employment law, contractor engagement, and the use of EOR and agent of record models. We also have Clark Bowles, Commercial Director at WTT. Clark leads the growth and strategic partnerships across the contingent workforce and recruitment compliance space. He has extensive knowledge of advising UK recruitment agencies specializing in helping those businesses manage compliance, legal risk, and operational complexity as they look to scale, particularly when they're looking at expanding into the US market. So I think on that basis, we have two people perfect to run us through the topics of the day. And last but not least, delighted again to be joined by my colleague Charles Dorr, who's Sales Director for Giant Global. Charles focuses on helping clients access talent globally and compliantly using Giant Global's international payroll services, which of course includes the US. Charles's clients mostly include UK recruitment businesses placing internationally, but we also support end hirers who are based overseas who want to hire workers globally as well. My name's Dan Haslam. I'm Chief Business Development Officer for Giant Group, so I'll be the host today. And as is the normal format for these sessions, I'll be running through the topics by asking the panelists a series of questions, and that should allow us to have a nice flowing structured discussion, leaving that time aside at the end to get stuck into questions. So without further ado, let's begin by setting the scene and understanding the US engagement landscape. So before we look at specific risk areas, I think it's going to be useful to discuss at a really high level how the US differs from the UK. So good afternoon, Carla. It'd be great to bring you in here.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, go ahead. We need the question first, don't we?
Yeah, you have the question. You have the question and then say hello. But from a structural perspective, how does the US labour market differ from the UK in terms of federal versus state regulation?
I was just going to say it's a pleasure to join you today to discuss the opportunities for recruiters, and of course, the risks in America as well. I think the fact that the US is an employer-friendly framework is probably the biggest opportunity or driver for recruiters. So unlike the UK, it's employment at will in the US. And that means that employers can dispense with employees without cause or at convenience, and likewise employees can leave whenever they want, unless, of course, there's an actual notice period in their contracts. So this causes a high turnover of employees and obviously more opportunities for recruiters. Now, this contrasts to the UK statutory protections that we have here, which obviously are going to be increasing with the Employment Rights Act, making it increasingly difficult to dismiss employees after a certain period of time. So employment at will is the biggie. With respect to the framework, federal law sets minimum standards around minimum wage, overtime, discrimination, but states have the authority to implement more protective laws. And of course, we've got 50 states, so it's really 50 little countries within one framework. And this contrasts to the UK, which has a centralized regulatory system. An example of this is sick pay and holiday leave. There's no federal paid holiday leave and very limited sick leave versus the UK, which guarantees sick pay for 28 weeks and 5.6 weeks of paid leave. Now, some states are more employer friendly than others. Texas, Florida, North Carolina, very popular destinations for UK recruiters looking to dip their toe in the water versus places like California and New York, which obviously is much more highly regulated, but don't dismiss those places. California's got a huge economy. So overall, the US regulation is more employer friendly and fragmented, whilst the UK has a more centralized employee protective framework.
Yeah, no, super interesting. And I think it's really important for the audience to be thinking about that framework at two levels, federal and then obviously state specific. Clark, it'd be good to just bring you in here. You obviously got quite a lot of experience now in helping UK recruiters to enter the US. Typically, what are the sort of first mistakes that you see UK recruiters making when they're thinking about making that shift?
Yeah, so I think that there's a few mistakes that I see quite commonly, really. So I think the first thing I would point out is, and I have travelled various places in the world and heard the exact same thing, is that UK recruiters are the best recruiters in the world. If you think the majority of the UK is pretty much a race to the bottom, low margins, high saturation, a lot of competition. It's an extremely tough market to be in. So when you go to somewhere like the States, which has nigh on 200 billion staffing revenue compared to the UK, which is 40 billion, plus you have 25% less recruiters, you're now in an environment where, yes, it's vast across a physical landscape, but there's also less saturation in terms of competitors, and there's scope for higher margins as well. I often use the phrase, it's like taking um, putting a UK recruit into the US is like putting a shark into a goldfish bowl. So, in terms of some of the mistakes I see is firstly taking a UK pricing structure across to the US. The US is not a race to the bottom, and Dan made an interesting comment before about will the last UK recruiter please switch the lights off, that was off the back of us saying about how much UK recruitment is moving to the US and how much interest there is in the US. What we don't want to do in the US is recreate that UK environment of racing to the bottom. Because of at will employment, as Carlos just mentioned, they could lose a VP on their lunch break without any notice period whatsoever. So the US is a candidate-led market. So what I would ensure is that when you are building these deep relationships, you understand your value because they see your value. Unlike a lot of places in the UK, the US truly value you largely because of the at-will employment. So, because you could have a great candidate that will backfill a space in 3 hours because the VP's left with no notice. So, really know your worth. The average margin across the whole of the US is 30%. That includes all blue collar. That includes medical. So, it's much higher for your white collar IT project sectors. So really don't be going in with 15-20%. I wouldn't do any business less than 25. And then lastly, have a niche. What the US can sometimes do is create almost like an Aladdin's Cave of Wonders effect, where you go in specifically for the lamp, and then you enter this cave of wonders and you just get sidetracked with a million different jewels and things. So have a niche, have a real laser focus. And by that, I mean, yes, pick a state, but also whereabouts within that state. If you think of Texas, the tech sector in Texas is bigger than the whole of the UK recruitment sector put together. And you can fit the UK into Texas 4 times over. So have a niche in the area, pick a state, pick an area within a state, pick a sector, pick a type of role, because there's going to be a huge amount of businesses there for you.
Yeah, I mean, just the getting across the scale of the opportunity over there, I think, it is mind-boggling, and it's no reason why there's plenty of UK recruiters looking further afield. I think you're spot on, Clark, to talk about the margin erosion not being the right approach. Recruiters over in the US are very much viewed as consultants, and consultancy, that's the sort of golden ticket that UK recruiters want to move to, and it's not achieved by just competing on price, for sure. So I think that's really valuable advice. As people obviously are starting to place contractors over in the US, once business starts moving, sometimes there's a bit of a thought that, as soon as you've placed a contractor in the US, that's going to create some form of taxable presence or corporate exposure for that UK agency, and so they've got a need to actually, incorporate and have a presence over there. It'd be interesting to get your views on that.
Yeah, so I guess my view on that is there is actually a lot of benefits in not having a taxable presence or a tax nexus in the US. And I think if you went to the US today, you've definitely got to have one eye on where you see your business in 3 to 5 years' time. Now, in 3 to 5 years' time, you may want to have boots on the ground. You may want to land and expand and get some US people, and you may want to have incubated a UK leadership team who understand the vision today, so that in 3 to 5 years' time, they are willing and happy and want to move to the US to help grow that business. But I also know huge amounts of businesses who never go to the US, never open an entity, never have a tax presence and do extremely well. In terms of the taxes that you would pay, not having a US presence can actually be of benefit. While there is no legal treaty between the two countries, there is tax treaties. One example, if you already operate in the US, your clients may have asked you to complete a W-8 BEN-E form. And what that means is you are a foreign business working with a US national client, so that they won't pay things like sales taxes. Is it beneficial in some regards to have a US entity? Yes. But would I do it in the first 3 years? I think wholeheartedly no. I would be making quarterly trips over there. I would want to shake hands with people and go to networking events and meet my clients. But there just wouldn't be too much of a benefit or a rush for me to start opening an entity across in the US.
Yeah, that is good advice, isn't it? Why make your life more difficult than it needs to be right at the beginning of that journey? There'd obviously be maybe reasons for credibility purposes that you're thinking that a presence is needed, but the reality is, and you've said it, there's many UK-based recruiters doing business over there, and they're doing it all from the UK. So it's definitely an option.
I know
Thanks, Clark.
businesses who have sold, who have set up in the UK. They've grew quicker than what they expected, and they've sold their business without even entering the US.
Yeah, wow. I mean, yeah, exactly. So it's definitely possible. But there obviously be for some businesses, they will feel like, no, this is the way that we want to go. We do want to locate over in
Yeah.
the US, and we want to sort of kick that on. And that's a nice neat segue into the next section, which is looking at contracts and commercial structures. Whether or not, if you're going to take your UK model and shift it across to the US, can you just use your existing contracts and do a few modifications to adapt it for the US? In reality, I expect it's probably a little bit more nuanced than that. So, Kyla, this is definitely a section for you to lead through. What would you highlight to the audience would be the key differences between UK and US contract enforceability?
Well, there's no duty of good faith in contract performance in the UK, except in employment insurance, and that does exist in the US. Damages in the US are obviously much higher, specifically punitive damages, which result in those huge jury verdicts that you hear about. And punitive means to punish. So that is to address reckless or malicious behavior. So the chances of a recruiter ever doing anything to that standard is very minimal. However, you need to make sure that you identify punitive damages in your contract and you exclude them because they're not covered under your insurance. Another variation is that the losing party doesn't pay the legal fees automatically in the US, whereas they do in the UK. There can be state variation, and of course, it's employment at will, so there's no need to even have an employment contract in the US. Lots of employers just send out an offer letter, so lots of variation.
Is it
Yeah,
worth
wow. I mean,
mentioning
it's
about legal jurisdiction, Carla, and how a lot of recruiters may think England and Wales?
Oh, well, absolutely. That's the problem in sending your UK terms over to your US client. Not only does it look wrong from a terminology perspective, because you're talking about CVs rather than resumes and being made redundant rather than being laid off, but if you have a clause setting England and Wales as the jurisdiction for resolving dispute, it's not to your advantage. And that's because there's no treaty between the countries for the enforcement of judgments. So if you were to chase your US client for fees and you had the jurisdiction as England and Wales, you'd have to bring a claim here, get a judgment, and then take it to Texas or wherever your client's based and do it again. But conversely, if you have it designated in a neutral venue like New York or even Texas, and they're chasing you, then they will have to bring a claim in New York first, get a judgment, and then bring it against your UK entity. So big advantage in getting that right.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose to Clark's earlier point, if you're going to look at operating in the US but doing it remotely, that's one thing. But you damn well need to make sure you get your contract licked up into shape, because they will look at that. And if it has got that UK flavour, you are going to start losing credibility straight away. You need to understand the market, but most importantly, protect yourself for the risks that you're going to incur in the US.
Yeah,
And
I
so,
mean, the
and so,
conduct
so
regs and
yeah.
AWR have absolutely no relevance to your US clients. So it just doesn't make a good first impression.
No, it needs to definitely be Americanized for sure. So you talked obviously about risk. So how should the contract be looking from an indemnity perspective to make sure it's structured in a way that's going to give the protections needed for US recruitment?
Well, hold harmless indemnities are very common in the US. So you'll see them littered in your US contracts. And generally those are acceptable to your broker, but you will need to discuss that with your broker. And obviously we'll be talking about insurance in a minute. How you structure those indemnities really depends on your bargaining position, as it does here in the UK. So if you can get away with making a unilateral indemnity by your client, so you're not indemnifying them, but they're indemnifying you, great. But generally it'll be a mutual indemnity.
Okay. And obviously it's standard practice in the UK. You try and limit your liabilities in clauses as much as possible. Is that also a good approach for the US?
Oh, absolutely. It's really important to limit your liability in US contracts due to the propensity of those large awards. So similar to the UK, you should limit your liability to a percentage of the fees that you'll earn in one contract year, or to a monetary figure of perhaps $1 million, or to the lesser of the two. But in no event should that be less than your professional indemnity or more than your professional indemnity insurance levels, because then you're exposing yourself to unlimited liability. So same concept as you'd expect in the UK applies in the US.
Yeah,
it's probably worth
good.
mentioning as well that if you have a good set of terms that were written for you, they will be pro your business. They will be pro agency terms and have your best interests at heart. Probably similar to what your end client have, but for them. So if your end client is giving you terms, just be really careful, because they will be pro the business. So in an ideal world, what you would always want to do is be on the front foot and offer your terms to be signed first before you're on the back foot and the end client has already sent you theirs.
Yeah, and I think also just tying into your opening piece, Clark, where we're talking about US recruitment being viewed, as a having high value consultancy type service. Let's not be afraid to put in a contract in front of the customer that is, protecting your business. A good good business, whether it's UK or US, often stems from a good contractual negotiation, because both parties understand they're engaging with another company that understands what it's doing. So you're building credibility straight away, as opposed to just rolling over on the commercial request or the contractual request.
100%, Dan. And do you know what else is worth pointing out is, like, some people say if you go into the US, prepare to be sued. That's probably more so the case in California than any other state. But American people and the culture is a litigious nature. So if you have a well-written document that has your best interests at heart, they will follow the rules in that contract, which is why the US is so good at paying 7-day payment terms, 14-day, maybe maximum there and thereabouts. They pay much better because they're fully expecting to be sued or penalised for not paying. So you're spot on. Get a good contract, and as long as you're putting it in front of them and know the worth of your business, it'll save you so much trouble in the long run.
Yeah, cool. That makes sense. I think that's a good position now to sort of take us into the next topic that we want to run through, which is how recruiters can use, EOR solutions and AOR solutions as common entry strategies to start looking at placing people over in the US. Before we get stuck into that, just a reminder to the audience, if you do have any questions that are occurring as we go through, please do put them in the Q&A or the chat function, and we can pose those questions to the panelists at the end of the section. But yeah, let's move on to that next topic then, looking at how employer of record and agent of record solutions operate in the US. Many UK recruiters initially do use an employer of record or agent of record solution to start doing business in the US without setting up a legal entity, but often there can be some confusion around those models and the pros and cons of using them. So, Charles, you've been sat patiently, and now this is your time to shine, certainly moving into your world. Can you give the audience a clear explanation of the differences between employer of record and agent of record, specifically when thinking about America?
Yeah, for sure. No problem at all. So, an employer of record is essentially a third-party company that legally employs the worker on your behalf. So if you hire someone in a US state where perhaps you don't have a legal entity, the EOR becomes the legal employer. We run the payroll, we handle tax withholding and filings, administer benefits, manage workers' compensation and unemployment insurance, and really ensure labour law compliance. So I guess the key point with the EOR is that we are the legal employer on paper. With an agent of record, again, we are still a third party that kind of sits between the recruitment agency and the end client and the independent contractor, whether that be 1099 or corp to corp, but we're not the employer. We operate as a compliance partner to assist with classification, compliance and payments, but we do not employ the workers. They would be really operating as independent contractors.
Okay, yeah, you dropped in a bit of terminology there. So for the benefit of the audience, corp to corp would be like PSE engagement, as we call it in the UK, paying a limited company.
Yeah, exactly. Where the contract has their... Yeah, sorry. So yeah, corp to corp is essentially where someone has their own limited company, and a 1099 would be like a freelancer or a sole trader equivalent to in UK terminology.
Yeah, cool. Well, that makes sense for sure. So obviously Clark touched on it earlier, but when would it, do you think, be appropriate for a UK recruiter to be thinking about employer of record models to help them move into the US market?
Sure. So I guess ultimately when you're placing talent into the US, an EOR model is typically appropriate when the worker should be treated as a W-2 employee. So again, W-2 is the terminology used in the US for an employed solution. And so if neither yourself as the recruiter or the end client has the infrastructure to employ or even the desire to employ, then absolutely you would want to use an EOR type model. So if the worker should be a W-2 employee, if the client requires a payroll employment solution, also if, say, misclassification risk was high, and also if you had, I guess, the lack of a US legal infrastructure yourself, these would all be contributing factors as to why you should perhaps go down the EOR route.
Okay. And for the same question, but with the AOR as opposed to the EOR, when does AOR make more sense, Charles?
Sure. I suppose as opposed to when, what about if I answer why? So an EOR is used by a company that perhaps has a concern around worker misclassification risk, IRS 1099 compliance, state level independent contractor laws that again can vary from state to state, co-employment exposure and audit liability. So there's a whole range of reasons why someone might want to use an AOR model as opposed to perhaps directly engaging. And so as I say, instead of perhaps engaging that worker directly themselves, they work with a compliance partner like ourselves to provide that AOR solution. And so what happens is we contract with the contractor. We review things like 1099 eligibility. We validate the business entity, again, if it's a corp to corp, as opposed to the 1099. We run compliance checks. We execute independent contractor agreements. And then, of course, we handle the payment side of things. So we pay the contractor, we issue the 1099 documents if applicable. And so really, it provides that compliance firewall for clients. So we're documenting the independent contractor classification analysis, and we're maintaining that kind of audit trail. So it's really there for those organizations that perhaps don't want to do all that themselves in-house. And want to use a specialist to assist with that. And I think, as I've said before to you and to other clients, there's nothing to stop an organization providing or operating an AOR model themselves. It very much comes down to the desire internally. Do you want to build a department to manage all that internally? Or actually, do you just want to engage a specialist who can do it all for you and add that extra level of protection? As I say, that firewall to keep you separated from it.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think we see it. There's many recruiters who operate AOR in globally with different countries, and they're often taking a lot of risk, either known or unknown, and it's more about protecting margin, not wanting to erode it by putting a partner in place. But then when you start considering somewhere as litigious as Clark and Carla have pointed out as the US, then you can well argue there's an argument to say actually you want to put another intermediary into the middle of this to give you that protection. Clark, you've obviously spent a lot of time advising UK recruiters to use EORs from time to time. So it'd be interesting if you could point out, what are the good things to look at when you're looking at engaging with an employer of record, what the sort of questions that you should be asking and the due diligence that you should be taking to make sure that you've picked a good partner.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing I would say is an EOR is absolutely invaluable in your expansion into the US. If you think 200 billion is generated through staffing revenue in the US, and roughly 90% of that it comes from contracting. So let's say 7% of the whole of the US independent contractors, 92% are what's called a W2 worker. The reason it's called W2 is W2 is the tax form, similar to what in the UK would be PAYE, for example. So the US is incredibly complex. You've got federal laws, then you've got state laws, and in some states they're so big, you then have local laws as well. So you've got multifactorial complexities when expanding. And what you are really, really good at is recruiting, finding candidates, getting job roles and matching them to the right people, maybe full talent solutions. So you need not just a partner who is going to pay your workers, but you need a partner who has in-depth knowledge of the US. And that comes for things like, do they have the right insurances? Do they understand the landscape of the US? Do they know the difference, as Charles has just pointed out, between an EOR and an AOR solution? Do they have both solutions? Because actually, whilst I think that the majority of all of your workers will be W2, you don't want to lose a client and allow creep in if they have got one or two independent contractors, and then you need to let another agency in who's using a different EOR for that. So I would be checking things like, do they have a 401k? It's some part of the solution. What do they do around healthcare? What are the fees involved? Is it a flat fee? Does it change by state? Do they have one that's covered across the whole of the US, across all 50 states? And really just maybe get some feedback as well from other agencies who are using them. But I can't stress enough how important an EOR is as your turnkey solution into the US. The US is incredibly complex, but you will probably not even realize that if you're using a great EOR, because they're taking all of those complexities away from you, allowing you to do what you do best, generate revenue, and not necessarily worry about any of those complexities.
Can I just add, Sorry, Dan, I was just going to add
Sure.
that your EOR will hold your hand on all compliance issues as well. So, for example, the minimum wage in the US is $7.25 at a federal level, but that will vary from state to state. In a little place called Tukwila, Washington, where they make the BOE engines, it's $20 an hour. So you wouldn't know that automatically, nor would you know what the overtime thresholds are, because
Yeah.
for overtime purposes, you're either exempt or non-exempt. At the federal level, the threshold's 35,000, but that will vary from state to state.
Yeah.
There's things like pay history legislation where you can't ask a candidate what they're making. You can ask them what
Final
they're
pay,
looking for.
California.
Yep. So there's 22 states now that have that. There's even a height and weight ban in New York City. So you can't discriminate on the basis of height and weight. Let
Wow.
alone things like restrictive covenants. The FTC tried to ban all restrictive covenants last year, but was overturned by a challenge from Texas. So that is where your EOR is worth their weight in gold, because they will know all those little idiosyncrasies from state to state.
Yeah, again, like we've spoken about, it's a partnership, it's a consultancy. You're leaning into the expertise of that EOR to add value to the business. And it's worth noting there's many US recruiters that use US employer of records for exactly those reasons as well. So that makes sense. At the flip side of that journey, though, Clark, we have, there could be coming a point, and you'll have had clients that get to that point where actually they're feeling like creating an establishment over in the US is the right way to go. Any points to raise there before we move on to our next topic?
Yeah, I've got a couple really. So I can see how that would be a logical thought process for a business entering in the US. And regardless of what your 3 to 5 year plan is, actually building up your knowledge over a period of time is going to be invaluable. So having an EOR is ideal for that. If I ask myself the question, when does it become legally and commercially viable for me to effectively payroll my own contractors through my own internal EOR? And as an example, I did some fag packet calculations just before this call. So I'll just really quickly run through them. So in terms of fixed costs, you've got a US entity that you need to open, let's say $5,000, compliance 5 to 15,000, payroll system, accounting and tax filings, workers' comp, liability insurance. That can often vary between 1% and 5%, depending on classification. You've then got federal and state filings, employment law contracts. You've got things like payroll, in order to be able to do your own payroll, benefits, time tracking, workers' comp that you'd need to get, employment practices liability, general liability. You'd need to think about variable costs such as FUTA taxes, SUTA taxes. So all in all, I think that it would probably cost around $190,000 per year to run around 10 to 15 contractors if you was to do it yourself. So I can't see any way how less than 50 contractors would be financially viable to not run through an EOR. The cost may seem greater because we're probably used to UK umbrella margins, but actually there is a lot of inbuilt costs in there with things like healthcare, just as a prime example. But even if you did decide that it was commercially viable, do you have the knowledge to be able to do that? And that's really where you can come unstuck, as Carla mentioned. Let's say final pay in California. Oh, don't forget, a worker can leave at will. So at 3 o'clock on a Friday in California, a worker doesn't tell anybody and just leaves their desk. California have final pay law, which means that worker needs to be paid everything they are owed by the end of that day, including bonuses. Otherwise, they can sue. Now, an EOR will take care of that. If you're a recruitment agency, not necessarily putting your full efforts into your EOR because you're using that as a solution to pay the workers so that ultimately you can recruit better, actually you could end up with litigation and things like that. So is it commercially viable to do it under 50 contractors? I would say no. Is it over? Potentially, but then you've got all of the legal risks, and you've got to think to yourself, I need to hire staff, I need the knowledge, and I need a lot of experience.
Yeah, no, it's really helpful, I think, to hang some numbers around that just to give context to people as to sort of levels that they should be thinking about. So great that we've got some short-term solutions and some long-term thinking coming through there. Thanks, Clark. Conscious of time, please do get questions in. I can see the Q&A starting to fill up, and we've still got a couple of topics to run through. So let's get cracking and move on to the chunky topic, I suppose, which is worker misclassification, the one that everyone likes to talk about. Worker classification is obviously under scrutiny across the globe, but the US is no different, and it's under significant scrutiny at the moment. So let's sort of take a little bit of a dip into the topic, and I'll come back again to you, Clark, to kick us off. How is worker classification determined in the US at a federal level?
Yeah, okay. So I'll run through this quickly because of time, but it's really worth understanding in the US that it isn't a single classification test. It's a patchwork of federal agencies or states that all apply various different standards, where companies often get it wrong because of this. COVID was a prime example. The worker classification test is done where the contractor is at that time. Then they moved during COVID, they moved to a different state. And actually, because states have different classification tests, sometimes they can move from being allowed to be working as an independent contractor to actually they should have been a W-2. So it's incredibly complex. I never thought I would say the words that IR35 is a lot more straightforward than the US classification tests. So if you think on a federal level, you have common law tests across the US. So common law is things like behavioral control, financial control, and then relationships. But then it moves and varies state by state, whether it's an economic reality test, looking at opportunities for profit and loss, level of control, performance of relationship, whether the work is core to the business. Then you've got Department of Labour tests, so a common law test. And then you have things like ABC tests as well. So it really is a complex market out there, which is, it's not the reason why very, very few work as independent contractors, but if you was testing your contractor base, you should find that 90% plus, unless you're in a very, very, very specialist area, are W-2 workers. And it's also worth pointing out, and I have seen this happen in the past, where if the IRS come knocking on the door, the whole supply chain is effectively liable and responsible for making that worker classification test, but also the liabilities off the back of it, off the back of it as well. The one party that doesn't have much responsibility or liability is the worker. So you can often find the worker will say, I want to be an independent contractor. For whatever reason, you're not using Giant because Giant would have done a really good classification test. Using another provider who didn't do a classification test, that worker can then contact the IRS. And I think the form is called an S58 potentially. And they can say that a worker classification test wasn't done on me. I should have been a W-2 worker. What will happen then is it will get backdated with the IRS if found that they should have been, and they'll get things like healthcare, overtime, bonus, penalties, all things like that they should have got if they were a W-2 worker. So it's extremely important that you know the landscape and you've done classification tests on the worker.
Yeah, and again, back to that point at the beginning, there's a reason the margins are high for recruiters operating in the US, right? Because they're absolutely protecting their clients from risk, and getting these things right, whether they outsource it through an AOR or whether or not they do it themselves internally. So that all starts to make sense. Charles, just bringing you in here, obviously in your experience, you've helped contractors or businesses engage independent contractors across the US. Any feel for where the states are that are more risky than others that you'd want to share with the audience?
Yeah, sure. So I think as Clark kind of touched on, the fact that you've got the federal level around that kind of behavioural financial relationship factors, and then you have kind of some states that have even stricter legal tests, stronger enforcement, and heavier penalties. I think where I've seen the strongest is again, Clark mentioned it, is the ABC test. And essentially, a worker is presumed to be an employee unless all three are true. So A is the worker free from control. B is the work outside of the hiring company's usual business, and C is the worker independently established in that trade. And if you fail one of those three, then you're an employee. So the states that I think, if I remember correctly, are strict on ABC style rules would be California, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. So those are the states that I'm aware of that are super strict when it comes to that kind of classification. I'm sure Clark can confirm if there are others that are just as bad, but those were the three that came to my mind.
Yeah,
Carla, have you got any,
agree.
or Clark, have you got any to chip in there? Any others to to be wary of from a risk perspective, or the opposite end of the equation are less risky?
No, I think Charles is pretty much spot on there. You've got like your California, I think Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, Delaware uses ABC tests for unemployment insurances, Washington. But yeah, ABC test. You've just got to make sure that you have a good compliance partner who knows the landscape, who can do these tests for you. If you go into the US, because just for full transparency, what really an AOR is doing, as well as the back office admin, is they are processing a payment into an LLC, which actually you could do, Mr. and Mrs. Recruiter, today. You could process a payment into an LLC. But this isn't about, and an EOR isn't about processing a payment to a worker. It's about protecting your business and having turnkey solutions so that you can expand into the US. And that is exactly what an EOR or an AOR solution is doing. It's having your best interests and compliance at heart, taking care of all the complexities so that you can continue to grow and expand your business. So, just make sure that you have a compliance partner that is doing the AOR classification tests.
Yeah, cool. Conscious of time, we've still got plenty to run through. I feel like we should have extended this webinar for an hour and a half because the conversations are so interesting. But let's move quickly on to the next topic of insurance. We'll then do some horizon scanning, which will be difficult given Mr. Trump, no doubt, Carla. But anyway, we might get there. And then we'll take on the Q&A. So, Carla, if I can just bring you in now just to talk quickly on insurance. And obviously, it's super important given the litigious nature of the US to get that right. What are the main types of insurance that are typically required when you're engaging workers in the US?
Well, first of all, you'll need to get an endorsement on your UK policy, because obviously if you're using your UK entity, you won't be getting a domestic insurance policy, but they will insure you for workers' compensation, which is your employer's liability. They'll insure you for commercial and general liability, which is your public liability, and they will insure you for professional liability, also known as E&O, errors and omissions, and that's your professional indemnity cover. The important thing to remember is that you need worldwide jurisdiction and worldwide territory, inclusive of the US, because you might look at your policy and say, oh, it says worldwide. Well, look at the small print. It'll probably exclude the US for obvious reasons.
Yeah, you usually see US and Canada carved out there, so important to read through the documentation. And without going into too much of the war stories, have you seen instances of what can happen if an agency places a contractor without the appropriate coverage in America?
Well, obviously, you'll want to make sure you've got a limit of your liability to direct losses to mitigate that risk. But if you don't have a well-drafted contract, I mean, obviously it could be catastrophic because the legal fees themselves could be just astronomical, even if you haven't done anything wrong. So the insurance is a fundamental part of this whole puzzle of getting this right.
Sure. So do your due diligence, get those boxes ticked, and make sure you go into market with appropriate protection.
Yeah,
Great.
it's
so
generally not too expensive either to add on an endorsement on your UK policy, obviously depending on your sector, but I've seen it as low as £500 to add on US.
Yeah, no excuse for not getting that priced into
Yeah.
the model then for sure. Okay, so then moving on to our last topic before we go into Q&A, just sort of horizon scanning and thinking about anything else that's coming through in the US from a legislative perspective. Carla, anything in particular you'd want to pick out or highlight to the audience that they should be aware of that's in the pipeline? And again, difficult given it seems like there's lots of to and fro in the US at the moment with the whole political landscape. But anything that you'd signpost to the audience to think about?
Again, I think insurance is the most important issue. With respect to compliance risks, we've talked about misclassification, overtime minimum wage, and penalties by the FLSA, which is why you need that EOR to hold your hand on those issues. But nothing in particular that I can think of that's looming. We've already dealt with the restrictive covenant ban.
And just as a general view for the audience in terms of direction of travel, is that you're feeling that enforcement on misclassification is becoming stronger and stronger in the US? Is that the direction of travel that the US is heading in? Or is it too difficult to say?
Clark, would you agree that it depends on the state?
Yeah, so I think in terms of that, I would say just some recent cases. You've got like Uber, which had £100 million misclassification lawsuit across them. Lyft, 20 million-ish. New Jersey, title delivery misclassification settlement in 2024. I think you've had some really big cases recently, and probably in the last couple of years, like big. We're talking like three-figure, like 100 million-ish. It's similar to what the UK government does with IR35. They try and put some big fish out there in the market to say, look, this is what we're going to do. But the US is extremely vast. So it will be hard to look at every single individual contractor. The risk you've got is if it's you, the other risk is the contractor can contact the IRS directly because they aren't liable for it. And as soon as things like your W-2 or your 1099 tax forms go in at the end of the year, it's very difficult to get away with anything. And the US is a lot more punitive than the UK in terms of taxes with the IRS.
Yeah, very good. Well, listen, that brings us to the end of the topics. So we can now move into the Q&A for the 5 or 6 minutes that we've got left. So thank you to the panel for the contributions there. Let's get straight into the questions. So we've got one firstly from James, who's asking what states would the panel recommend targeting when launching in the US? And then as a follow-on from that, we have a separate question from Charles. It's the same question, but thinking specifically about healthcare professionals. So what states do you think you'd recommend as being good places to start trading in if you're a UK recruiter looking over the pond? Clark, do you want to take that?
Yeah, okay. I think this isn't a get out, but it really depends on what it is that you're going to do. You've really got to think of the US as 50 different countries. For the first time ever, Texas now has more Fortune 500 companies than New York. And a lot of that was the migration through COVID. So I still get many businesses who say, I want to go to California or I want to go to New York. And I completely understand it. And the opportunity in somewhere like California is enormous. But would I do it myself? No. I want to recruit from a farm model somewhere on the East Coast, somewhere where I could go on holiday, see some clients and actually enjoy it. So I think if I was going to the US tomorrow, I would look at my 3 to 5 year plan. Do I actually want boots on the ground? Because if I want boots on the ground, I'd look at places that where I would want to live myself, where there's good universities, things like that. But I mean, top state, if I just give you top states, 5 states at the moment, you're probably looking at Texas, Florida, California, New York, North Carolina. I would say they're the 5 up and coming is probably the wrong word, but the 5 good, big, continue to grow states.
Okay. I think that's useful. Like you say, people are just looking for where do I start because it's such a big conundrum. So I think that's just useful to point people in the right direction. There's one here maybe for you, Carla, from Peter. Just a question regarding terms. When you operate with a UK client that also operates in the States, do you have any useful insight into fees? So you have agreed, say, a 20% fee in the UK, and on occasion it's ever been signed by someone in the US to the UK. How can you avoid carrying that rate across to the US site of that same business? I hope that makes sense. So just to repeat through, when you operate with a UK client that also operates in the United States, do you have any insight into fees? Let's say you've agreed 20% in the UK. Does that automatically apply? I think is the question, to work that you're doing in the US. How do you avoid carrying that rate across to the US site?
Before I answer that question, I think we should answer the other question about medical placements in the US. And from my experience, Boston comes up a lot for medical placements. So that whole area in New England is very hot for that. With respect to carrying over the rates, I mean, US entities wouldn't expect to see such low rates. That's my answer. Clark and Charles, would you agree?
Yeah, I don't think they'd expect to see low rates, but they definitely accept it if they
of
had
course.
it in front of them. So I think that's a really difficult one, whoever asked that question, because you either want to set your stall out at the beginning, knowing that they have a US and a UK presence, and say, here's our UK rates, here's our US rates. Or if you're already in that situation, you probably don't want to be doing US placements on a UK contract. So I think that would be a really good place to say, oh, great, you've got some business. Can I just send you over our US terms? And within that, you've got your US fees as well.
Yeah, and I think the question just highlights immediately that point that you need to get your mindset in the place on rates. This is not the UK that you're operating. It's a total different ball game. And if you're not priced accordingly, that could actually cost your business. It's certainly not rate sensitive. It's time for a couple more. We've got a question here from Andrea, who's asked, I'd love to understand how rebates work if there is a high turnover of staff. So I think Andrea's thinking about if it's this employment at will, and within a typical recruitment contract, you have fee rebates in there. How does that pan out in a US context?
We very rarely see rebates. We see replacement. Quite common to have replacement, not rebate in the US.
Good. That was a simple one. We've got time for one more here. Question: can a company based in the UK work with a recruitment agency based in the US and have the employee on their own payroll in the UK? So this is in reverse a little bit, isn't it? Can a company that's based in the UK work with a recruitment agency based in the US and have that employee on their own payroll in the UK? Probably not is the answer. I think that's more of a UK based. It sounds complicated. It's a UK based question. And I think in reality, in that situation, if the person is employed by the UK client, then you've just done a perm fee, not a temp fee. And if it's temp, you probably want to be thinking about that worker engaging through an umbrella company. And we probably know one of those that might be a good help and good place to place them. But we'll wrap up, I think, at that point. Clark, Carla, Charles, brilliant. Thank you. I really, really enjoyed that. And certainly when we run a next session, we may need to think about just trying to reduce the scope because there was so much good stuff to talk about there. But it'd be great if we could do a follow-up further down in the year to get your further thoughts on that. Thank you to the audience for joining us today, and thank you for all the questions. There are a couple there that we didn't quite get to, so we will try and mop them up on follow-up, and we'll get feedback from the panel on those. We will be sharing the recording of today's session. That will go out on email tomorrow. So thanks for attending. And it just remains for me to say, enjoy the rest of your afternoon wherever you are. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.